I woke up before sunrise, as I have done since I was a child, even after there was no one else waiting for me in the kitchen. That habit never left me, as did that stubborn hope that maybe that day could be different. I spent a few seconds looking at my reflection in the cracked mirror of the simple room and arranged my hair carefully, as if each strand in place was a way of preparing myself for something bigger. It was the day of the community assembly, a rare event where everyone gathered in the central square. And that day, for the first time in years, I believed that maybe I would finally be seen differently. I separated the most beautiful dress I had, a light blue one that was worn out by time, but clean, well-ironed, saved for special occasions. As I got ready, I remembered the times I tried to fit in, to help, to prove myself. I brought food when neighbors were sick. I took care of children who weren't mine. I worked extra hard without ever complaining. Deep down, I still believed that kindness generated recognition, that one day someone would look at me and say, I belonged there. When I left the house, the morning air was cool, and for a moment, everything felt light. I walked to the square with firm steps, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest that always appeared when I had to face everyone together. From afar, I could already see the movement. People gathered in groups, talking, laughing, exchanging looks that never included me. Still, I took a deep breath and continued. As soon as my feet touched the center of the square, the conversations began to die down. Not immediately, but like a wave that spread slowly. A look here, another there, until the buzz turned into a charged silence. I already knew that, the way his eyes changed when they landed on me. The silent judgment that always came before any words. I tried to smile, like I always did. I tried to maintain my posture, as if I didn't notice. But then someone spoke. An older woman, her voice firm enough to echo among everyone, said what I had heard before, but never in front of so many people. She said I shouldn't be there. He said my presence brought problems. He said that since I appeared, nothing had gone right in that community. Other voices began to emerge, first shy, then more confident. Comments, accusations, distorted stories that grew over time. Every word was like a stone being placed on my shoulders. I tried to speak. I tried to defend myself, but no one wanted to listen. They never wanted to. Someone stepped forward and said, with cruel clarity, that I was cursed, that everything around me ended badly, that people like me shouldn't live with others. And this time, no one disagreed. Nobody hesitated. The silence that came after was not in doubt. It was in agreement. I felt the ground disappear for a moment. It was no surprise. Deep down, a part of me always knew that day could come. But experiencing that, in front of everyone, was different. It was definitive. Still, I didn't cry. Not there. I just stood still, with my eyes fixed on some point, trying to maintain what little dignity I had left, trying not to tear myself apart in front of someone who had clearly already decided who I was. Then the order came. They said I needed to leave. They said I was no longer welcome. They said it was for everyone's good. I looked around, searching for a single face that showed doubt, compassion, anything. I didn't find it. Not even those who once accepted my help dared to look into my eyes. And at that moment, something inside me changed, albeit silently, even if no one there noticed. Without arguing, without begging, I just nodded slightly. I turned my body and started walking, feeling each step heavier than the last. Behind me, the murmur returned, as if nothing had happened, as if kicking me out was just another task for the day. But before I could completely cross the square, a different movement caught everyone's attention. I heard the sound of a car stopping at the main entrance, something rare in that region. The conversation stopped again, now for another reason: curiosity, expectation. I looked, the door opened, and from him came a man I didn't know personally, but whose presence was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just his clothes or his appearance, but the way he occupied the space around him. Safe, firm, observant. He began to walk slowly, his eyes analyzing every detail, every person, until he found mine. And unlike everyone there, he didn't dodge. I tried to ignore it, tried to keep walking, but something in that look made me hesitate. It wasn't judgment. It wasn't contempt. It was something else, something I didn't immediately recognize. He headed in my direction, even with everyone around him watching completely. The silence. Some tried to get closer, as if they wanted to explain, justify, prevent, but he paid no attention. He stopped a few steps away from me. For a moment, no one breathed. I felt my heart quicken, not with hope, but with confusion. I was used to being avoided, rejected, singled out, not to be looked for. And then, without saying a single word, he did something no one expected. He extended his hand towards me. The gesture was simple, almost common, but in that context it seemed impossible. I hesitated, because in that place, at that moment, no one would ever dare touch me. And still, he waited, as if he had already made his decision. As if, unlike everyone else, he didn't need to hear any explanations. The silence that took over the square was no longer one of judgment. It was something deeper. It was the beginning of something that no one there was prepared to understand. Time seemed to slow down as his hand remained outstretched, firm, patient, as if there was no hurry in the world. I looked at those fingers as if they were something forbidden, something that shouldn't exist for someone like me. For years, they avoided any contact with me, and when it happened, it was by accident, always followed by disapproval. Now, in front of everyone, that man not only approached, but also offered me a gesture that defied everything I had experienced up until that point. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear like before. It was a strange mix of doubt, fear, and something I no longer easily recognized: hope. Behind us, the silence began to become uneasy. People whispered, exchanged glances, trying to understand what was happening. That scene didn't make sense to them. I couldn't be touched. I couldn't be accepted. But he was still there, without looking away, without removing your hand. I swallowed hard. My first impulse was to retreat, as I have done so many times in my life, an automatic reflex of someone who has learned not to take up space. My fingers even moved slightly backwards, but something inside me stopped. A thought crossed my mind with a clarity I'd never had before. If I backed away at that moment, I would be confirming everything they said about me. And for the first time, this seemed unbearable. Slowly, almost afraid that the gesture might disappear, I raised my hand, and I played. The contact was light, but the second my skin touched his, everything changed. There was no light, there was no sound, but something went through my body like a silent shock, hot, intense. My eyes widened uncontrollably. My breathing hitched, and I knew he felt it too. His fingers closed around mine instinctively, not to hold me, but as if he needed to confirm that this was real. His look changed, still firm, but now full of surprise. Not an ordinary surprise, something deeper. All around, the impact was immediate. I heard something hit the floor. I saw people retreating. The murmur returned, but different. It wasn't contempt, it was fear. Because everyone there knew the stories. They knew what that meant, the bond, but that couldn't be happening. Not with me. A woman put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. A man further back shook his head repeatedly, as if denying it could change what was in front of him. I tried to pull my hand back, scared by the intensity, but he didn't let the contact break so quickly. Not with force, but with enough firmness to maintain that moment. And then our eyes met again. But now it was different. He wasn't just watching me anymore. He was recognizing me. And it was at that moment that something inside me really changed. Because in that look, there was no doubt. There was certainty. A certainty that no one there was prepared to accept. Voices began to rise around me. Someone said that was wrong. Another said it was impossible. There were those who shouted that he needed to get away immediately, that this was dangerous, that he didn't know who he was dealing with. But he did not react to any of these voices. His focus remained on me, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. I felt the weight of all those looks again. But now it was different. It wasn't just rejection. It was something unstable, almost broken, as if the place I occupied in that community had just been irreversibly broken. And that scared me. Not because of what they were saying, but because I had no idea what came next. My life has always been made of clear limits, predictable rejections. I knew where I could step, even if it was a small space. Now, everything seemed out of place. His touch still burned on my skin, not with pain, but with an energy I couldn't explain. My body reacted on its own, as if recognizing something that my mind hadn't yet reached. Then he gave a paw. That's closer. And this movement alone made some people retreat without realizing it. His presence, which was already strong, became even more intense. It wasn't aggressive. It was a decision. It was then that he spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, but carried with an authority that left no room for interruption. He asked my name, just like that. No charges, no judgment, without mentioning anything they were saying. Just that. I took a second to respond, as if he had forgotten how to use his own voice. Nobody there asked my name like that. When they talked about me, it was always full of labels, of distrust. But in that moment, it felt different. I replied, low but clear enough. And when my name came out of my mouth, I saw something change in his eyes. It intensified, as if that confirmed something he already knew. All around, reactions became more agitated. Some people began to argue among themselves. Others approached, not knowing whether to interfere or just watch. The order that had always existed in that place had completely disappeared. And in the middle of all that, it was still just the two of us, connected by a touch that no one could explain. I felt the weight of that moment grow inside me, but along with it came another sensation, quieter, more dangerous. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being put out. I was being chosen, and that changed everything. My name still seemed to echo in the air when silence once again fell over the square, but now filled with tension. It was no longer the contemptuous silence I knew so well. It was restless, uncomfortable, as if everyone there was facing something they couldn't control. He didn't let go of my hand, and that alone bothered me more than any words. One of the most influential men in the community has stepped forward. The rigid face, the voice trying to regain the authority it always had there. He said it needed to stop, that he didn't understand what was happening, that I wasn't someone he should even talk to, much less touch. But none of that had any effect. His gaze moved slowly to this man, not with anger, but with a calculated coldness that made him hesitate before continuing. It wasn't the look of someone being challenged, it was that of someone who was already above that discussion. When he looked at me again, the difference became even clearer. There was something there that didn't exist for anyone else. My hand was still in his, and the sensation only increased. It didn't decrease. It was as if that contact was awakening parts of me that had been dormant for years. My breathing slowed, but each beat of my heart felt stronger, more present. I tried to understand. I tried to find logic, but all that came was memory. I remembered all the times I was avoided without explanation, the looks that changed when I approached, of opportunities that disappeared before they even existed. They always said there was something wrong with me, but they never said what. And now, for the first time, someone looked at me as if something was right. The man in front insisted, now with a harder tone. He said it wasn't just inappropriate, it was dangerous, that old stories already warned about people like me, that this type of connection would only bring destruction. The words, people like me, hung in the air. I felt the impact, but this time, I didn't lower my head. Something inside me was changing, reorganizing. He then slowly let go of my hand, but didn't move away. The heat remained on my skin, like an invisible mark, and even without the touch, the connection didn't disappear. It didn't break. He took a step forward, standing slightly in front of me, not as someone who hid me, but as someone who recognized me as part of something that was now also his. When he spoke again, his voice was firmer. He said he knew exactly what he was doing. He said he didn't need anyone's opinion there. And then he said something that made the air heavy. He said that the bond does not make mistakes. The reaction was immediate. Denial, indignation. Some started to laugh, but it was a strange, nervous laugh, as if it were too absurd to accept. Others spoke at the same time, trying to deny, dispute, invent whatever explanation was more comfortable than facing the truth. Because if that were real, everything they believed until then would crumble. I stayed silent, feeling my own body react to each word. The fear was still there. I could feel it, but it no longer controlled me. There was something new growing inside me, something that I still didn't know how to name, but that prevented me from shrinking like before. One of the women who was most critical of me stepped forward and pointed directly at me. He said it was manipulation, that I must have tricked him somehow, that there was always something strange about me, something that was not natural. The word hung in the air, strange. For years, that's how I was defined. But for the first time, that seemed small, because next to me was someone who didn't see this as a defect. He saw it as something different. He turned his face slightly towards me, and the look he exchanged with me needed no explanation. There was no doubt. There was no retreat, and at that moment, something inside me firmed up once and for all. The confusion still existed, but it no longer paralyzed me. I took a deep breath, feeling the air coming in with more force, as if my lungs were finally really working. I straightened my posture, even with all those eyes on me, and when I looked around again, I realized something I had never noticed before. They were not in control. For the first time, they weren't the ones who decided who I was. The tension increased with every second. Some people started to move away, as if getting too close could affect them in some way. Others remained there, trapped between fear and curiosity, but no one dared to approach, because now there was an invisible line, and no one knew what would happen if they crossed. Then he made a simple gesture. He extended his arm slightly back towards me, without even needing to look. A silent invitation, not for me to hide, but for me to choose. And in that moment, everything I had experienced up until then seemed to condense into a single decision: continue being who they said I was, or take a step into the unknown. I looked at his hand for a second, and this time, I didn't hesitate. My fingers moved firmly to his, but now there was no doubt. It was choice, and the moment I touched him again, the impact was even stronger. Not just inside me, but around, because everyone noticed. That wasn't an accident. It was accepted. And that made everything impossible to deny. The second ring wasn't just more intense, it was definitive. When my fingers intertwined with his, the feeling that ran through my body stopped being confusing. It became something clear, unquestionable. It was as if something inside me had finally found its right place after years of being out of whack. My breathing evened out, but my heart, hitting hard, firm, as if marking a new beginning. All around, the reaction completely changed. What was once restlessness turned to despair. Some evidently retreated, opening up space as if they were facing something very dangerous. Others stood, staring, unable to look away, trapped between fear and the need to understand. Because now there was no more doubt. That wasn't a mistake. It was no coincidence. It was a bond, and it was happening there, in front of everyone. The man who previously tried to control everything lost his rigidity. His face changed, as if he was finally realizing that this was beyond his reach. He said he needed to stop, that there was still time to correct it, as if it were possible to undo something that had already happened. But no one moved, neither does he, because deep down, everyone felt it. There was something there that could not be forcibly separated. I felt the heat rise up my arm, reaching my chest with intensity. It wasn't pain, but it wasn't smooth either. It was like a truth being branded inside me. My eyes closed for a moment, not out of weakness, but because it was too intense to ignore. And at that moment, memories came, fragments. Situations that previously seemed disconnected began to fall into place. The times I realized things before others. Moments when I avoided something bad without knowing how. Sensations that came before any sign. Everything that they always called strange. Now it seemed to make sense. It seemed to have a purpose. I opened my eyes slowly, and the world around me was different, sharper, clearer, as if I was seeing it without the filter of fear that I always carried. And he noticed. His grip changed slightly, not to control me, but as a response to what was happening to me. I felt it. His eyes analyzed my every detail, not with concern, but with true attention, as if he recognized that something important was happening. When he spoke, his voice was lower, but still firm. He said I needed to breathe. Just that. And for the first time, someone said something to help me, not to silence me. I obeyed. I breathed in slowly, feeling my lungs fill completely. And when I let go, the tension I had carried for years seemed to ease, even if just a little. But it was enough. The surrounding voices returned, louder, more agitated. Accusations, desperate attempts to explain what no one could understand. Some started to blame him, saying that it was his responsibility, that he had caused something he shouldn't have done. Others insisted I thought I was always a problem, that just confirmed everything. But none of those words hit me in the same way. It was as if an invisible barrier had appeared around me, not because I was closing myself off, but because, for the first time, I didn't depend on those voices to know who I was. Someone who had been close to me in the past stepped forward. I recognized it. He was one of the people who received the most help from me. His look was different, mixed with fear and guilt. He tried to speak. He tried to say that maybe it could be resolved, that maybe there was a less serious explanation. But it stopped in the middle, because he didn't even believe what he was saying. I perceived, and it hurt, but not like before, not like something that broke me. It hurt like confirmation. It was never about me not being enough. It was always about them not wanting to see. He let go of my hand, but this time it didn't feel like a separation. It was just physical, because the connection was still there, clear, firm, impossible to deny. He turned completely towards the crowd, and something changed in his posture. It was no longer just someone defending a choice. It was someone taking a stand. Then he said, "I wasn't going anywhere." The sentence was simple, direct, but it fell like a sentence. The impact was immediate. The idea of expelling me, which before seemed so right, began to lose strength. Some still tried to argue, to insist, but there was no longer the same conviction. Their security had broken, because for the first time, I wasn't alone. And more than that, I no longer needed to beg for space. I already occupied it. I felt it clearly. For the first time, I didn't have to ask to stay. I just was, and no one there could change that. The wind passed through the square, lifting dry leaves from the ground, breaking the weight of the air for an instant. But the tension was still there, dense, loaded with everything that hadn't yet been said. I looked around once more. The same faces, the same place, but nothing felt the same, because everything that used to diminish me no longer had the same power. And in the midst of it all, a truth began to take hold. Silent, but impossible to stop. I was never what they said. And now, finally, this was being seen. The weight of this truth began to spread across the square like something alive. It wasn't just opinion anymore. Something had really changed, and no one there could pretend they didn't see it. I remained standing, my body feeling firmer, as if everything inside me was finally aligned. The insecurity that previously controlled my movements no longer did. The fear still existed, but it was no longer enough to make me back down. And that was new, profoundly new. My eyes passed over each person there, but now I wasn't looking for approval. I wasn't looking for shelter. It was as if I was seeing everyone for the first time. And what I saw was not strength, it was fragility. People who always needed to blame someone to feel safe. People who built certainties about me without ever trying to understand. People who now seemed lost in the face of something they couldn't control. One of the older men, known for keeping the traditions of that place, stepped forward. Unlike the others, he didn't scream. He didn't accuse in anger. His face was heavy, as if years of certainty were being shattered at the same time. He looked straight at me, and, for the first time, there was no contempt. There was doubt. He said it couldn't be ignored. I said that if the bond was real, then everything they believed about me needed to be revised. His words had a different weight. It wasn't defense, but it wasn't an attack either. It was the beginning of a break. Some reacted immediately, trying to interrupt, saying that it didn't make sense to change everything because of a single event, that the old stories couldn't be wrong. But there was no longer the same firmness. I realized this clearly. The control they had was cracking, and it all started the moment someone decided to touch me without fear. I felt a tightness in my chest as I remembered everything I experienced there. The humiliations, the looks, the doors closed, the nights trying to understand what was wrong with me. And now, there, the answer began to appear. It was never a mistake. It was ignorance. My breathing got deeper. My shoulders adjusted, almost without me noticing. It was like I was finally occupying a space that had always been mine. He was still by my side, in silence, but not far. Gift. And that made all the difference. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, nor did he need to convince anyone. His stance made it clear that the decision had already been made, and I didn't depend on anyone there. A woman who had previously led the accusations tried to speak again, but her voice no longer had the same strength. He said it could be a mistake, that maybe he was being influenced, but it stopped in the middle, because no one followed with the same certainty. Some still agreed, others no longer knew, and some just couldn't believe I was the problem anymore. Silence returned, but now it was different. It was a confrontational silence. Every person there seemed trapped in their own thoughts. I felt it, and for the first time, I didn't want to run away. I didn't want to disappear. I wanted to stay, Even with everything uncertain, there was a clarity growing inside me. I didn't need to prove anything. What happened there already spoke for me. But along with that, something new came. A question. If I was never what they said, so what am I? And this doubt did not come as fear. It came as a possibility. And that changed everything. I looked at him for a moment, almost without realizing it, as if searching for some answer. But what I found was no explanation. It was recognition, as if he knew this was just the beginning, something bigger, something that was still forming, but it could no longer be stopped. The wind got stronger, messing up my hair, but I didn't move. I stayed there, firm, gift, and for the first time in my life, entire. As I stood around, I watched everyone begin to realize, too late, that perhaps they had spent years rejecting the very thing they had never been able to understand. The question kept echoing inside me, but not like a void. It was like a space that, for the first time, could be filled. For years, everything they said about me defined my limits. But now, without those bonds, something unknown began to emerge. I still didn't know how to name it, but it no longer felt wrong. And that was exactly what started to bother those around him even more. Because it wasn't just the bond, it was the change in me. A visible change, impossible to hide. I no longer had the same look as before, nor the posture of someone asking for permission to exist. There was a silent firmness growing inside me, as if every part of me was reorganizing itself to support a new reality. The older man, who had previously expressed doubt, took a deep breath and spoke again, this time more carefully. He said that if this really was a true bond, then there were ancient rules that needed to be respected, rules above anyone's opinion there. Those words caught attention. Some agreed, as if this were a way to regain control. Others just watched, still lost. I listened carefully. Rules. It was strange to think about it. There were always rules in that place, but they were never used to protect me. He then moved. He took a step forward, not to confront, but to position himself. His presence seemed even greater, not because of strength, but because of certainty. He asked what rules, simple, direct, without accepting assumptions. The older man hesitated for a moment, choosing his words. He said that once a bond is formed, it cannot be ignored or undone by pressure, that separating two people linked in that way could have serious consequences, for them and for everyone around. A murmur ran through the square. For the first time, something there favored me. The irony was clear. For years, they used traditions to keep me away. Now these same traditions prevented them from continuing to do so. I felt something different when I heard that. It wasn't relief, it was consciousness. Awareness that, if it had only depended on their will, nothing would have changed. But something bigger interfered, and it couldn't be controlled. One of the women who rejected me the most came forward, visibly uncomfortable. He said it didn't matter what the rules said, that this was wrong, that everyone knew it. Her voice shook, not from weakness, but out of frustration, because, for the first time, she was not being obeyed. He looked at her calmly, but did not respond directly. Instead, he turned to face everyone again. And then he said something that changed everything. He said he would take me away. The sentence was low, but enough. The impact came instantly. Some were scared, others revolted. Questions arose, accusations returned, but nothing seemed as solid as before, because now there was a real possibility. I would leave, but don't expel, chosen. I felt the weight of it inside me, to go out. That place was all I knew for years, even though it was never really mine. That's where I learned to survive, but never belonging. The idea of leaving made me feel uncomfortable, not from attachment, but closing of a version of me that lived there, that resisted there, that was shaped by pain. My eyes passed over the square once again, but now without looking for anything, just acknowledging what that place was and what could never be again. He then looked at me, not imposing, but making it clear that the choice, it was mine. It always was, and perhaps that would be the biggest change of all. I took a deep breath, and I realized something simple. Nothing there held me back anymore. Neither do people. Not the words, not the past. The only thing that could still keep me there, it was fear. And for the first time, he was no greater than my desire to follow. My fingers moved and found his again, but now there was no need. It was a decision. And in that gesture, There was an answer. Not for him, for me. All around, the tension still existed, but it no longer had the same weight, because while everyone was trying to understand what to do with that new reality, I was already letting go of the old one, and no one could stop that. Intertwining my fingers with his was stronger than any words. There was no more hesitation, no doubt. This was no longer about proving something. It was about accepting that the life I knew was behind me. And everyone noticed. The woman who had previously seemed small now no longer carried that weight. It was as if something had been taken from me, and that bothered me. Because control was never just about rules, it was always about keeping someone in the place they chose for them. And now, that place was empty. The older man tried to speak again, perhaps trying to regain some order. He said that if I left, I wouldn't be able to come back. That would be definitive. For years it would have destroyed me. But now, I just listened. No despair, no fear. The idea of not going back didn't feel like a loss. It felt like freedom. Back to what? To a place where I was never accepted. For people who only began to doubt when they could no longer deny. I kept my gaze steady. I didn't need to respond. My posture said it all. Nothing there was mine yet. One of the younger women stepped forward. Her gaze was not angry. There was confusion. She asked, almost in a whisper, if that meant everyone was wrong. The question remained in the air, heavy. Nobody responded, because admitting it required responsibility, and few were ready. So I spoke, for the first time. My voice was calm, no tremor, weightless. I said I didn't know exactly what I was, but I knew what I wasn't. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't the problem, they said. Every word came out clearly, effortless, and the impact was greater than any scream. Because it didn't come from revolt. It really came. I wasn't asking them to believe. I wasn't trying to convince. I was just stating. And at that moment, everything changed. He watched me in silence, and I noticed a faint sign in his eyes, almost imperceptible, but present. It wasn't like someone was validating me. It was like someone who recognized the strength of a choice being made at the right time. Tension still existed around, but he no longer dominated. Some began to move away, not out of a clear decision, but because staying there meant facing a truth that they could no longer avoid. Others remained, motionless, as if they were still waiting for everything to return to normal. But nothing came back. He made a slight movement with his head, indicating the way he came. The car was still there, waiting, just like everything that came after. I followed his gaze for a moment, feeling the weight of that next step growing inside me. It wasn't just about getting out of there. It was leaving behind a whole version of myself, a version that supported, that resisted, who survived, but it no longer needed to exist in that way. Before moving, I took one last look at that place, the square, the people, the memories, and to my own surprise, I didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter, closing. Not everything needed to go with me, and that was also a choice. I took the first step, then another, firm, no rush. The sound of my footsteps seemed louder than it really was. Maybe because, for the first time, my every movement was conscious. He walked beside me, without pulling me, without guiding me. Just there, gift, and that said more than any direction. Behind us, no one tried to stop it. No one had the courage to cross that invisible line, because deep down, everyone knew. I could no longer be treated like before, and that was what sustained the silence. It wasn't acceptance. It was incapacity. When I got close to the car, I stopped for a moment, not without a doubt, but because of the weight of that moment. Everything that came before ended there, and everything that came after was still unknown. But, unlike before, the unknown wasn't scary. He called. I took a deep breath once more, and without looking back again, I followed. Because there are doors that don't need to be closed. They only cease to exist when you decide never to cross again. The sound of the car door closing seemed louder than it actually was, like an invisible limit between everything that I was forced to live and everything I could still discover. I stood on the bench for a few seconds, with my hands in my lap, feeling my own breathing. The silence inside was different. It was not empty. It was new. No judgments, no looks. Without that constant feeling of being watched, he entered from the other side and started without rushing. I didn't say anything. And somehow, that calmed me more than any words. He didn't seem to want to fill the silence, as if he understood that that moment needed to exist, exactly like that. The car started to move, and I haven't looked back. It wasn't effort, I just didn't feel the need. The first few minutes passed in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. I looked out the window, seeing everything I had ever known. Each place carried a memory, places I've been to, where I helped, where I tried to fit in. And yet, I never belonged. Now, seen from there, they seemed smaller, distant, as if they were no longer mine. I let out a light sigh. I couldn't even explain what it was. Maybe relief, maybe tiredness, maybe the start of something new. He noticed. Without taking his eyes off the road, he asked if I was okay. The question was simple, but different. There was no judgment. It was real. It took me a while to respond, not without a doubt, but because I never really stopped to think about it. How was I? I took a deep breath before speaking. I said I didn't know, and it didn't sound weak. It rang true. He nodded slightly, as if he understood, as if I didn't need more. The car continued, and the landscape began to change. The houses became more distant, the movement decreased, the noise was left behind, and inside me, something also started to slow down, but not completely, because with silence came thoughts, clearer, more organized, and some that are hard to ignore. I turned to face him for a moment. It was still strange. His presence was unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't just confidence, it was something firm, something that didn't need to prove anything. So I asked. I wanted to know why he did that. Why did you choose me? The question came out straight, but it was years old. He didn't respond right away. He slightly adjusted his hands on the steering wheel. He thought, and then he spoke. He said it was not a common choice. He said that when he touched me, there was no doubt, and that could not be ignored. I listened in silence. Part of me wanted to understand everything, but another part already knew. Not everything is explained right away. Some things only make sense over time. I looked out the window again, but now I wasn't seeing the outside. I was looking inside. My memories began to reorganize. Situations that once seemed like errors now seemed like signs. Nothing was random. And that brought something new, no doubt, but discovered. The car continued climbing, entering a more distant region. Nature started to appear more. The air felt different, lighter. I felt it before I even realized it. My body responded first, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't tense. He slowed down and turned onto a narrower road. The place was unknown, but it didn't seem dangerous. On the contrary, there was a strange feeling, family, as if I should be there. I frowned, realizing this, and before I asked, he spoke. I said this was my new beginning. The sentence was simple, but I felt the weight, not as something imposed, but as a real possibility. The car stopped. I looked around, and I understood. It wasn't just a different place. It was a place where no one knew me, where no one had decided who I was, where there was no past defining me. And that, it changed everything. I sat for a few seconds. No rush, no immediate fear, just feeling. Because for the first time, what lay ahead was not marked. It was blank. And instead of scaring me, it started to feel like freedom. I haven't opened the door yet. I remained sitting for a few seconds, observing everything around me, as if I needed to make sure this was real. The air there felt different, lighter, cleaner. But it wasn't just that. It was as if that place had no expectations for me. There was no story. There were no labels. There were no eyes ready to judge me before I even said anything. It was neutral territory, and for the first time, it didn't put me on alert. My hand rested on the doorknob, but I didn't rush. There was something happening inside me, something deeper than simply arriving in a new place. It was as if, little by little, I was learning to exist without having to defend myself all the time. He didn't rush me. He remained silent, respecting that moment as if he knew exactly what it meant. There was no urgency to it. There was no expectation, just presence. So I opened the door. The sound was soft, almost discreet, and when my feet touched the floor, a sensation ran through my body. It wasn't intense like his touch. It was different, more stable, deeper, as if that place recognized something in me. I took a few slow steps, taking in everything around me. The landscape was peaceful. Trees, open space, buildings in the background that looked simple but well cared for. There was no noise, there was no commotion. It was a calm place, but not empty. It was a firm calm, structured. I realized this effortlessly. He came over and stood next to me. For a few seconds, we both just stared straight ahead, in silence, until something changed. Voices, steps, movement. I turned my face away automatically, my body reacting reflexively. But it wasn't fear. It was an old habit, still present, but it no longer controlled my actions. Some people were approaching, and they were different. There was no hostility on the faces, but there was also no familiarity. They were attentive looks, curious, observing, trying to understand who I was. I felt it right away. But unlike before, those looks were not filled with judgment. They came from analysis. And this was completely different. A man approached first. From the way he and the man next to me looked at each other, I knew there was trust there. They exchanged a quick look as if they didn't need words. Then he looked at me, carefully, no contempt, but also without immediate acceptance. And, strangely, this felt more honest than anything I had ever experienced. Then he spoke, and he introduced me. He just said my name, nothing more. No explanation, no justification, no labels, just my name. That had a weight to it that I had never felt before. Because, for the first time, I was not a problem being explained. I was a person being introduced. The looks around changed a little. There was still caution. There was still curiosity. But something clicked. I felt it. And that made something inside me firm up even more. A woman who was a little further back stepped forward. He crossed his arms for a moment, then relaxed. He looked at me from top to bottom. Not arrogantly, but pay attention. And then he asked a question. Simple. She wanted to know if I understood what that meant. The bond, my presence there, everything that had just happened. The question wasn't harsh, but it wasn't light either. It had weight. He had responsibility. I felt it. And for a moment, silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't judgment. It was space. Space for response. I took a deep breath, and I chose not to pretend. He said he didn't completely understand, but I was ready to find out. My voice was firm. No fear, no recoil, and somehow, that was enough. The woman nodded slightly, as if he recognized something. Not a certainty, but a disposition, and that had value. The people around began to disperse little by little. I realized it wasn't disinterest, it was understanding. That initial moment had already been enough. There was no need for pressure or immediate responses. I stood there, taking it all in, but something inside me was no longer the same. It wasn't just freedom, it was belonging. Not a belonging based on the past, but in the possibility. He moved a little closer. He didn't invade my space, but he closed the distance enough for me to feel his presence more clearly. And it was then that I noticed something new in his eyes. It wasn't just certainty, it was expectation. As if this was all just the beginning. And for the first time, it didn't put pressure on me. It awakened something different. Willingness to understand, willingness to grow. I wanted to find out where it could take me, because after a lifetime of being limited by what they said I was finally faced with the chance to discover who I could become. And this desire did not come as something uncontrolled, came firm, rooted, as if it was always there, waiting for the right moment. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to what they did to me. I was moving by something that came from within, and that changed everything. The following days began without major events. Nothing dramatic, but full of small changes that, together, transformed everything. The looks I received there were different. There was still caution. There was still observation. But there was no automatic rejection. And for someone who was always rejected before she even spoke, this was strange. I started observing more than talking. Pay attention to how people moved, how they interacted, how they organized themselves. There was a structure there, but it wasn't based on fear, nor in exclusion. It was built on recognition and responsibility. Little by little, I began to understand that the bond that formed wasn't just between me and him. It was a positioning, a change in my place in the world. He was present in everything, but never ahead, never leading me like someone who needs to be led. He walked beside me, and that strengthened what was growing inside me. One day, while walking in a more remote area, surrounded by trees and silence, I stopped for no apparent reason. My body reacted before my mind, as had happened before, but this time, I didn't ignore it. I closed my eyes. I breathed. I felt it, and I realized there was something in me, a sensitivity, a connection with the environment, something that was previously treated as an error. But now, it made sense. And for the first time, I wasn't scared, I accepted. When I opened my eyes, something inside me was clearer, not completely defined, but real. Weakness has always been the name they gave to something they didn't understand. And now, I was starting to understand. Later, when I came back, he was there, waiting, not urgently, but present. And that no longer made me uncomfortable. It was familiar. I approached without hesitation, and I spoke before he even asked. He said he was starting to feel it, that it wasn't like before, that I no longer wanted to deny. He listened in silence, and he nodded, as if he already knew. But then, for the first time, he added something. I said that what I felt was not just part of me. It was part of what I could become, and it was still just the beginning. The words didn't scare me. They gave me direction. The days passed, and I changed. My posture, my voice, my look. I no longer flinched. I didn't mold myself to fit. I occupied, and this began to be noticed, not with empty words, but with respect. A respect that grew little by little, based on what I demonstrated, what I became. Until, one silent afternoon, as the sun sank below the horizon, I found myself alone, sitting, observing the sky, breathing weightlessly, no rush. And for the first time in a long time, I thought about what was left behind, in the square, in people, in words. And to my surprise, I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel angry. I felt understanding, not for what they did, but that's why that never managed to change. Me. A slight smile appeared, small, but true. Because now, everything made sense, not the suffering, but what came after him. I was never the wrong one. I have never been a failure. I was never a curse. I was something no one had the courage to recognize. And when they tried to push me away, this is exactly what brought me to where I was always meant to be. I got up, calmly, feeling my body light, firm, gift. And when I took the first step, there was no doubt, not even about who I was, not even about what I left behind. Because some stories don't end when you're rejected. They begin the moment you decide to no longer accept a place that was never yours. And in that silence, in that new world, a truth firmly established itself within me. I wasn't expelled for being weak. I was pushed away because I was too strong to continue being ignored.